All right, afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Savoy. I appreciate you coming on your Saturday afternoon and spending it with us. My name is Bruce Patton. I'm the curator here at Savoy, and we got a very special program for you. I'd like to mention first the current exhibits that we have, so hopefully you got a chance to look at those. If not, maybe after the program you can go and see the cars. We have the Quiet Greatness, the Japanese collectible cars, and the one Gallery A. We have the American small cars, two of them in here. The others are out there in the gallery. Hopefully you got to see the supercars that were out there in C. And the one we just put in last weekend, actually, was the locally owned cars. So hopefully you got to see some of those. And we were pretty excited, too, to get a couple Batman cars in here. So we're hoping some of the kids get to see the Batmobiles. So, and, of course, for us older kids, too. So in 2025, here's a list. I won't go through all of it on what we have coming. So the locally owned is what we just put in. The next one, though, I will mention is the fabulous fiberglass and the stunning Studebakers will be the next two exhibits coming. And then also the barn finds, which is in May with Tom Cotter. So it'll be another fun exhibit coming. So we just had Rat Race. I think that was last night here in the theater. So again, here's our schedule for 2025. The next one coming up in March is Baby Driver. So you can come and see that. I'd like to thank Styles Auto Care, as always. I appreciate their sponsorship. Without their help, we couldn't put on these great programs that we're doing every month. So I'd like to thank them again. And now, I know you're not here to hear me talk. You're here to hear Derek Moore from Lane Motor Museum. So Lane is a friend here, Derek is a friend here from the Lane Museum, and they've been kind enough to loan us a lot of different cars for exhibits. Matter of fact, they loaned us this Farmo Road for this exhibit, which is a very, very special car. So Derek is the curator there at Lane and was also a past curator at a couple other museums there with the Henry Ford and also the National Corvette Museum. So I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Derek.
All right, test. All right, perfect. I got it right, Blake. All right, well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm normally here at night, so it's a good thing I said afternoon. My name is Derek Moore. I'm the curator of collections over at Lane Motor Museum. I know I see one gentleman wearing a Lane Motor Museum shirt here in the audience, but have any of you been over to Lane Motor Museum? Okay, a few. Those that have not, are you familiar with us? Folks familiar with the name Lane Motor Museum? Fantastic. Well, this is kind of one of our areas of specialty, let's call it, oddball small cars. So when Bruce asked if they could borrow a car from us for the exhibit, specifically the Farmer Road that is behind me, and then asked if I could come do a talk, it was pretty easy to say yes, because they actually, believe it or not, these are the more commonplace small cars that Lane Motor Museum would deal with. So this one was a little easier to put together a talk on and do the research on. So all that being said, I thank you guys for joining us for the talk, and I suppose I will dive into the conversation. So let's see if we are... Nope. All right, there we go. So as I say, we're going to talk about American small cars, specifically focusing on American Austin, which turns into American Bantam, and then the Crosley cars that were produced in the Cincinnati, Ohio area. But really to begin to understand why these small cars came about in the U.S., we have to look back a little further in history, at least in automotive history, to understand why we wound up with these small cars at this period. And really the first two types of vehicles we need to understand are what we would call the cycle cars and the economy cars of, let's say, the pre-World War I and then the interwar period between World War I and World War II. because this is where these type of small cars really develop out of, the understanding of these small cars and then developing them in the time period that both American Austin and Crosley were starting up with their cars. So, the cycle car craze, that is what it is often referred to in automotive history. This actually starts out in France. In 1910, a company creates a car called the Bedalia cycle car, okay? And it is, the reason we call it a cycle car is it is a motorcycle engine that powers a very small, often home-built kit type two-seat vehicle. And often the two seats are in a row, right? They're one in front of the other. And interestingly, most cycle cars, the Bedalia specifically and some of the other ones that come around, the driver actually sits in the back, okay? Because it balanced the weight ratio of having the engine up front and then always having a driver in the back would balance your weight out so you wouldn't get any type of pendulum swing in the back end or anything like that. So the Bedalia kicks off. People start hearing about it all around the world. You know, France, it's a big hit over there. And over here in the U.S., a number of companies start building these cycle cars based on the Bedalia. Probably one of the most famous, James Scripps Booth up in the Detroit area, creates the Scripps Booth cycle car. And it is very much modeled after the Bedalia. You see it there on the bottom, the wonderful green car. That is part of the Henry Ford collections. And it actually does quite well. The Scripps Booth Company goes on to build numerous cycle cars and then actually moves into building kind of smaller economy cars, which we're going to talk about here momentarily. But the thing that really happens in the U.S. is that the cycle car companies expand on that idea of making these affordable cars for the masses. And although some of the companies like Scripps Booth will build these in a factory, there are a number of other cycle car companies that will sell you a kit to build these for yourself, to have an affordable car to drive to and from work. And believe it or not, the way they would ship it to you is the body became the shipping crate. So they would literally take the body that they had, they would pack the wheels, the engine, everything in it, and then they'd ship it off to you, and you'd just take everything out and put it together. And then you'd be able to have your car to run and drive. And that theme is what's going to carry on into the American Austin and the Crosley companies of kind of having an affordable car that people can use. So, the economy car. Now, you're probably a little more familiar with the history of the economy car because the car that really starts this craze, the economy car craze, is remembered by many, the Austin 7. Many of you remember the Austin 7 from England, the little kind of coupe sedan that they built over there. They also had roadster versions. Very, very, very popular car. So popular, not only in England, but around the world, that that Austin actually made a lot of their money by licensing the ability to build the car in other countries. Okay? So, have you guys ever heard of a little car company called BMW? Yeah, guess where they got their start? They bought a license from from Austin, I'm jumping ahead, from the Austin company in England to build a licensed version of the Austin known as the BMW Dixie. And that was their first car. Okay? So we kind of have this economy car craze happening all around the world. Here in the U.S., a company decides they want to go into building something like this, and it becomes the American Austin. Okay? And that is the company that will eventually evolve into the Bantam behind me here. Now, also around the world, we get companies that want to create a car, and maybe they don't want to pay the fee for licensing, right? They want to make money but not have to spend money. And believe it or not, actually, you've probably all heard of Nissan, right? They start out as Datsun or Datsun. They actually build an illegal copy of the Austin from England to start out the Datsun company, which will turn into Nissan down the road. So this is kind of the beginning of the small enclosed car craze, or what we would kind of call the economy car today. Okay, so these are the two things in automotive history, the two moments in automotive history that really kind of leapfrog everything forward into the small cars you see behind me. Okay? So, American Austin Company. As we say, I've already said, this was a licensed copy of the British Austin that was built over in England. It's incorporated here in Delaware in 1929, and they actually located the factory in Butler, Pennsylvania. So just like today, companies will incorporate in a different state based on incentives, things like that, and then they have their factory located somewhere else. So it's a Pennsylvania-built car by a Delaware company, technically. Interestingly, the bodies are designed by actually Count Alexis, I never say his last name right, Desaknovsky. But this is a very interesting kind of touch to the American Austin, because the Count is actually known for designing some of the highest end automobiles in the U.S. at the time. He was involved with companies like Peerless up in Cleveland, Ohio. He did design work for, if I remember right, Marmon, and a couple other of the very, very high-end automobile companies. So American Austin was also approaching this from an idea that they wanted to build a small, affordable car, but they didn't want it to lack on styling. So they brought in probably the greatest design stylist of the period to actually design the car for them. American Austins, word got out, marketing got out, and of course having a decent design behind it. It wasn't just a bland, flat car. A number of big names owned these cars. Al Jolson, Buster Keaton, who's actually pictured at the bottom there leaning on his car, and even Ernest Hemingway owned an American Austin. And then if anybody remembers our gang, the Little Rascals, at one point they actually had an American Austin in the movies as well. So you would think that with a lot of celebrities, let's call them at the time, right, that's what we call them today, owning this, people would kind of be interested in it and get behind it and start buying these little cars because they were affordable. And some people did. But they also became a bit of a joke in American culture and American society, okay? So some Americans were ready and they did buy these cars, but a lot of Americans weren't quite ready for a small car like this. We have a very big country, right? And we have very modern road systems. England, Germany, all the places that were also building these type of cars have very, very, very old street systems and very, very old villages and cities where, a horse and cart can make it through, so you need a small car. But here in the U.S., we had wide open space. Why do we need this tiny little car, right? So a lot of Americans didn't get the idea behind this, especially when the first American Austin, the American Austins when they came out, they cost $5 more than a Ford Model A. So you could go out and buy a Model A, or you could go out and buy an American Austin for $5 more than that Ford. And Ford had a reputable name and a quality product. So which one are you going to buy? You're probably going to lead towards the Model A. The only thing that really the American Austin had the Model A beat at was it got about 40 miles to the gallon. So it was a much more fuel-efficient car. Model A is getting about 20 on average. And that was about it, because it actually produced less horsepower than Model A as well, right? Smaller engine, less horsepower. So total production from the time the American Austin comes into being until it folds, they only build about 20,000 cars, okay? In 4.5 years, Henry Ford builds almost 5 million Model A's, okay? Big difference there, right? The Model A was much more popular than this little American Austin that was being turned out. So, as I say, it becomes a bit of a joke here in the U.S., and it starts showing up in various places as kind of a goofy car that's a joke, and everybody gets a laugh at this, kind of tiny little thing running around. So much so that I was able to find a couple of old newspaper clippings that had jokes about the American Austin. The one here that says "laughs from the shows." I don't know if you can read it. I don't know how high res it is, but the lady brings her car in and says, "I want a glass of water for the radiator, a thimbleful of oil for the motor, and a demi-tasse of gasoline. I think that'll be all." How many folks know what a demi-tasse is? Yeah, yeah, it's just a little tiny cup. Your espresso cups, if you drink espresso, some of the small teacups, those are demi-tasse, right? So the joke here is it's so small I don't need anything for it. And then the mechanic says, "Well, couldn't I cough in the tires too?" You just fill them up. And then the other one, you see the wrecker driver pulling into the shop with this little tiny American Austin hooked to the back. And the guy's in the shop joking with him. "All right, tell us about the big one that got away." The old fishing joke when you have a fish this big, and the one that got away was that big. So Americans really weren't quite ready, as I say, for this idea of this very, very, very small car that was so popular in other places around the world. So, the American Bantam Car Company, the company that produces this wonderful vehicle here, this comes out of the American Austin Car Company, okay? In 1934, so the company American Austin had been founded in 29. By 1934, the company is struggling so bad that they file for bankruptcy and actually cease production of the Austin cars in 1936. Now, one of the salesmen had tried to save the company. His name was Roy Evans. He had worked very hard in the last few years to try to turn the American Austin Car Company around. Couldn't do it, but he figured out that if they filed bankruptcy, he could reorganize the company and try again, right? He could bring another car out and try again. So that's exactly what they do. The company files bankruptcy, goes into reorganization, and they start working on the idea of bringing out another version of what they had built. And they will call it the American Bantam this time. And of course, anybody's a chicken fan in here, Bantams are very small, the word meaning something very small, right? That's a bantam of anything. And interestingly enough, they're able to go back to the Count, and I'm not going to try to say his last name again, but they actually get him to restyle the cars, okay? So again, getting one of the great American automotive designers to come in and style a car that was already proved that it was a struggle to get it done the first time around. But he agrees, and he charges them a very, very small fee to actually redesign the car and really make it a much more modern vehicle than what the Austin had been. The Austin had a very 1920s look to it. You get to the Bantam, he rounds out the radiator, the grill shell up front, full fenders. I mean, really styles it so that it is a modern era car that he hopes people will be able to fall in love with and enjoy. Now, they also take a page from, in my opinion, Cleveland, Ohio, and the Jordan Automobile Company, and a gentleman named Ned Jordan. And they come up with advertising schemes. Okay, Ned Jordan was famous for this up in Cleveland. And they name the cars these really fanciful names. Okay, so you have the Riviera, you have the Hollywood, you have the Playboy, all evoking this idea of a much different lifestyle than driving this little tiny car around, right? You don't think driving this little tiny car around, you don't think Hollywood, right? Hollywood is big Duesenbergs at this time and, really high-end cars. So it's an attempt to get the American culture to think that the car is a much different part of a lifestyle than it probably really is, right? We're talking about an economy car here. So you can see the advertisement up there for one of the Bantam Playboys, which was the Roadster version. Handy as a polo pony, the Bantam Playboy. So really trying to evoke certain emotions from people. And, up to 60 miles on a gallon of gas. Other models offered the coupe, the pickup, the panel delivery, as low as $439 complete at factory. So you'd have to go to the factory and pick it up. But the Roadster would cost you $479. And that was delivery at factory as well. So you'd have to go up to Butler, PA to be able to get that affordable price. But unfortunately, just like the American Austin Car Company, the Bantam doesn't catch on. They don't get sales going. Things do not go well for the company. And by 1941, they're closing up production of the cars, closing up the company after only producing about 6,000 units of the Bantam for sale to the public. Now, interestingly, there is one thing that Bantam should be recognized for, although many of us forget it because of a company out of Toledo, Ohio called Willis Overland, the Willis Company. Willis Overland has done a very, very good job of making everyone believe that they were the folks that created the famed World War II Army Jeep, where in truth, they were not. It was actually the American Bantam Company. You see the Bantam Jeep here. This was actually the prototype that won the government competition to build one of these general purpose vehicles. And the problem was, well, number one, you have the company folding and the factory shutting down, so they're not going to be able to produce it. So Willis's version, which was very similar to this, came in second. And the government basically went and said, okay, you guys can clearly build the vehicle because you built the prototype of it, so you're going to take the Bantam version, and you're going to build it for us. So Willis Overland actually is the company that winds up building most of the Jeeps. They can't even handle the total production and winds up Ford builds a few. They have to actually send out production to other companies as well. But if there's one thing you all take away from today about the American Bantam Company, they created the Jeep, not Willis. And I own Willis Overland cars, and I'm going to stand up here and tell you to remember that. So unfortunately, still America in the late 30s and 40s, we're not really into this type of car, okay? It's too small for the American culture and society, and it just cannot take hold here in the U.S. So, Crosley. We're going to jump over to Crosley and talk a little bit about where these wonderful Crosleys come from. This, of course, being the Farmer Road, which we'll get a little more in depth here in a little bit. So, Crosley Motors Incorporated is created by a gentleman named Powell Crosley Jr. He's a well-known Cincinnati entrepreneur up there in Cincinnati, Ohio. He had a fascination with the automobile from the time he was a kid. He actually built a small car in his youth. I couldn't find out what happened to that car. I don't know if he built it and drove it around a little bit and then trashed it. I don't know. But then when he got a little later in life into his 20s, he actually started attempting to start car companies. And in 1909, he built a prototype of a car he called the Marathon 6. Unfortunately, couldn't get the backing and support to financially afford to fully go into production. And so that didn't work. And then in 1913, we're going to reference back to the beginning of this presentation, he creates the DeCross cycle car. He jumps into the cycle car craze, okay? So he's already thinking that the way to get a car company going is to have a small, affordable car for the masses, right? Something that the average person can own. Because in 1913, guess what? If you were owning a car, you were pretty wealthy. You weren't exactly an average American if you owned a car, still in 1913. So he understands that that's the way we have to get average Americans into the automobile. And you can see up there at the top That is one of the old photos of the DeCross cycle car that he produced. Very, very few produced, and both of those companies, as I say, failed. The Marathon 6 really never got into production. The DeCross, very, very low numbers, and quickly failed. Sales just weren't there. So he kind of moves on to other ventures, as most entrepreneurs do. So he co-founds the American Automobile Accessory Company in 1916. They become the largest automobile accessory company in the U.S. at this time. Okay, so think J.C. Whitney of the 19 teens. Okay, that's what he creates. And this company makes Crosley actually probably multi-millionaire at the time. People start buying accessories for their cars, and just everything that he has to offer seems people are buying. So he's making a great amount of money. And so now he has money to invest in other ventures. All right? And I'm sure all of you have heard the Crosley name one way or another, whether it's the automobile or maybe a refrigerator that you all had. A radio. Anybody have a Crosley radio at one time? No? No? Oh, yep, there we go. You're right in the one light. So he starts venturing out into these other ideas. And actually, interestingly, the radio, which Crosley is probably, in my opinion, most famous for his radio, that all starts with his son. His son comes to him one day and says, "Man, Dad, these new radios are really cool." I said, "Okay, well, let's think about it. Let's figure out." Well, he goes out, and the cheapest radio, although he is by this time pretty much a millionaire, the cheapest radio is like $700-800 at the time. Okay, he doesn't. So he's like, "Now we can, entrepreneur, engineer, we can do better." So he goes home. They order parts that go into a radio, and he and his son build a radio. And he realizes he can build it way cheaper than what it's being sold for. So he goes into radio production. He starts up a factory, produces radios, becomes the Crosley radio. Okay? So this is kind of Powell Crosley's mindset. Okay? We can do things cheaper. We can do things better. And as you see up there, one of his early radios became one of the most popular radios in America. If I remember right, I think it sold for like $20 or $30 compared to the $700-800 radios that were being turned out by the big companies. So everybody can now listen to the radio. So much so, he also started a radio station in Cincinnati. And it just so happens it broadcasts still to this day the Cincinnati Reds, right? Everybody, baseball fans. And Powell Crosley happened to also own the Cincinnati Reds at one point, at least part owner. So Powell Crosley is also the man we have to thank for having shelves in our refrigerator doors. Okay, he created the Shelvador refrigerator. The first refrigerator to come out with an actual storage rack in your door, of course, making it more affordable so more people could have access to chilled and refrigerated foods, right? Easier to preserve your food sometimes if it can be chilled or frozen. So Powell Crosley, obviously starting all these companies, getting these things going, he's making a lot of money. And he still hasn't forgot about that passion for the automobile and wanting to build an automobile that he could build affordably and small, economical, so that the average American could actually afford to have a vehicle. So, in the late 1930s, Crosley Motors is incorporated, and with the intent of producing a small, affordable car for the masses. Okay, right around 1937-38, when they're working on the incorporation of the company, they build a prototype, and it's simply known as CRAD, C-R-A-D, which actually stands for Crosley Radio Auto Division. So this is the Crosley Radio company that he's got going. They make this little automotive division over here to start the automotive company and get its feet wet and get things going. Now, the prototype is the car you see parked, over here on the bottom. Unfortunately, I didn't really think about it. I don't know if we can turn the turntable enough. Folks back here may not be able to see it, but if you can see the rear end of that car, you notice it's very, very narrow. And you don't see the wheels at the rear, right? So when Powell Crosley designed this car, he was thinking about ways to make it more affordable. How can you reduce the cost of production? Well, one trick is to bring the two rear wheels in really close together. And what that does is eliminates the need of a differential gear because you don't have so much space between the two tires trying to turn a curve. So you don't need differential gears. You can start removing some of the costs of building a car. This is where his mindset was. Now, there's a number of problems with putting a very narrow track at the rear of a car. You don't get kind of the weight balance that you need. They like to kind of tip a little bit here and there. We actually have a number of cars at Lane Motor Museum that have narrow rear ends, and we are very careful when we turn them. So it kind of came about that that wasn't going to be a great idea, although it would save money. Safety-wise, probably not the best idea to build the Crosley with the narrow rear track. So they changed that. They build an actual standard layout chassis with the wheels at the same track as the front wheels. And they, in 1939, unveil the car at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Okay? Now you have to remember, this is a car that is, the company's headquartered in Cincinnati. They're actually doing some production in Marion, Indiana. But Powell Crosley's not, he's a pretty sharp guy. He's not dumb. He unveils the Crosley at probably one of the most significant automotive attractions in the U.S. at the time, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, right? Everybody knows the Indianapolis Motor Speedway at this point. And so where better to unveil a new car and get some press about it? So he unveils the car there. Actually, over a multitude of days, they have a couple days that they have rented the track, rented the space to have this unveiling. You see a picture there from the unveiling of one of the cars. And he gets a ton of press. It actually works exactly the way he wants it to. And so the Crosley name is all of a sudden fairly well known in the U.S. Of course, beloved in Cincinnati for everything he's doing there. So Crosley probably becomes the most successful small American car producer of an economy car of this type. The company actually exists from 1939 until 1952. They actually make it through World War II and start production up again on the other side. Very few car companies were able to do that. Only the biggest ones really were able to do that. World War II is a big reason we have so few automobile companies in this country. Total production actually wound up around 84,000 units over those years. So still kind of paling in comparison to people like Ford and Chevrolet and all of those. But for a small company, building a small car for a very select part of the U.S., a very select demographic of people in the U.S., they were extremely successful. Okay? So, also, Powell Crosley, as I say, he was also an engineer. That was what he went to school for. He also did a lot of innovation in these little Crosleys. Okay? So, to go through the list, it was the first mass-produced, what we call slab-sided or pontoon style car in the U.S., 1946, alongside Kaiser Frazer. Okay, they also brought one out at the time that was a slab-sided design. And of course, the ponton-style car became quite famous in the 1950s. Well, here you have Crosley Motors kind of introducing it to the U.S., all right? First mass-produced overhead cam engine, what was called the Cobra engine. Now, Cobra, a lot of people think of a certain other car that was built and its high-performance capabilities. The Crosley Cobra engine was not a high-performance engine. It was actually a copper-brazed engine, often referred to as the sheet metal engine, because they only had a casting for the crankcase, okay? Everything else was copper-brazed sheet metal. Cylinders, jackets, pan, everything. Okay? It was an extremely lightweight engine. Matter of fact, there's Mr. Crosley holding one in the air, okay? Picking it up and just holding it there. It was extremely lightweight, but they found over time that, heat cycles, all of that with the sheet metal, it had failures. It was not the best engine they could produce, so they actually took the design of it and created a fully, cast engine that was much, much better quality in their cars. Crosley is also the first company to use the terminology sports utility. So we all know SUVs today, sport utility vehicles. Powell Crosley is the first man to use that in automotive history. And you see the ad up there for the new Crosley, a fine car, sports utility. So it was actually one of the many body styles you could get within the 1948, what they called the Model CC lineup. He also was the first American-built car to be fitted with four-wheel, this is the factor here, caliper-type disc brakes as standard equipment. There were other companies that had four-wheel disc brakes, but they were a little bit differently engineered from what we would think of as the caliper style that we have today. Okay, so basically all of the cars you have today, if they've got disc brakes, they have caliper style disc brakes. This is the man that brought that to the U.S. automotive market. Okay, so it's also the first post-war mass-produced American sports car was the Hot Shot. There's a Hot Shot out there, isn't there? Yeah, so the Hot Shot is out there. Take a look at it. And as you see here, I say, sorry, Corvette, because Corvette was not America's first sports car. It truly was the Crosley Hot Shot. Now, you look at it and you don't think much of that. But the Crosley Hot Shot could top out around 70 to 75 miles an hour in the early 1950s. Okay? Go look at the car and see if you'd want to do 70 to 75 miles an hour in that car. It's a hoot, but it's a little nerve-wracking. And you can see one actually being raced there. Oops, sorry, over here, down in the corner there next to Mr. Crosley. Oh, I got two things here. I'm sorry. Going to try to turn it a little further. So if you can see that kind of over the hood of the Bantam now, that is a photo taken in one of the, I believe that was a beach race where they were racing the Hot Shots. So again, kind of going back to that idea, small cars that some of them became jokes, right, in our newspapers and in our culture. But Powell Crosley introduced some pretty important stuff in his little Crosley car, okay? All right, so now the cars at center stage. I want to talk about these two really quick. I asked them to bring these two out for very specific reasons. And I want to start with the American Bantam station wagon. So let's swing that around here. So this is a 1939 American Bantam station wagon. And this was actually the first year of production for the station wagon model in the Bantam lineup. It was actually the most expensive American Bantam you could buy at the time. It would cost you $565. Doesn't sound like much to us today, but it wasn't. It was cheap, but not that cheap back then. And it's considered by many automotive historians to be the smallest station wagon ever produced and the smallest woody station wagon ever produced. And of course, I think you can all understand what I mean when I say a woody wagon. Everything here is built from wood. There's no sheet metal covering that wood. It is a full wood body. Now, station wagon-wise, station wagon history, station wagons are developed out of vehicles known as depot hacks. The reason they had that name was because they are the cars that would tend to take people to and from the train depot as they came into town or they were leaving town. They were also typically much larger than this, right? But you'd carry your luggage and all your things in there. And, whether it was a hotel that owned it and they would transport guests, or there were average American people that would own a Model T depot hack, or a Star. In 1923, Star was actually the first to bring out a station wagon, as we would call it, to the production American automotive market. But as people used them and got used to them, they realized that they really were a great family car. They were what they needed to haul the kids around, to go get groceries, to go pick things up that they were buying at the store, furniture, whatever, and be able to bring home. So station wagons actually became very popular for a very long time in the American culture. I mean, today we don't really have station wagons. There are a few out there, but mostly we've switched over to, let's go back, Powell Crosley, sports utility vehicles, right? And crossovers. So, this was just American Bantam kind of catching on to one of the fads that were going on of building these station wagons that people were so interested in having in the late 1930s and into the 1940s. So, switch over to the Farmer Road real quick. I love this turntable. It's great. Because the Farmer Road is a very, very interesting vehicle in small American automotive history, car history. So we'll bring it around here. So when Powell Crosley introduces the Farmer Road in 1951, this is the statement he makes about it. Here, at last, is the machine people have been longing for and wishing for as a tractor, a powerful workhorse for farming, plowing, cultivation, mowing, and so forth. A fast, economical vehicle for road trips, a rugged truck for hauling and towing, a mobile power plant for sawing wood, spraying, etc., all combined in one lightweight, low-cost machine. That is the Crosley Farmer Road. And as you can see here from the ad, what he was talking about was the fact that with the Crosley Farmer Road, he sold a bunch of accessories, okay? The vehicle, I will call it, not a car, the vehicle came with all kinds of accessories for around the farm and around the yard, okay? He was trying to build a vehicle that really the average American farmer could use, or let's say small farmer could use around their farm and their acreage, okay? So, what did the Farmer Road get you? Well, it got you a six-speed forward gear and 2 reverse, so you could have high and low basically in reverse. Industrial tug or tractor, pickup or dump box, so there was either a stationary box, this one has a dump box on it. 2-person to 5-person road car. So in this one, what they did is when you come up afterwards and look, there's actually a removable seat in the back for your passengers. And this was all for $795. Now, it also has front and rear power takeoffs for around the farm, available with attachments, such as a moldboard plow, a snow plow, disc harrow, rolling coulter, which is what you see in the photo there, a cultivator, a reel-type mower, a sickle bar mower, a hay rake, row crop seeders, fertilizer unit, row guide, and governor. Crosley even offered steam-bent wooden front snow skis for the Farmer Road. Okay, he was trying to build basically the ultimate all-purpose vehicle here. Okay, and there were actually quite a few of these sold. People actually liked these. And got a lot of use out of them around their farms, their small farms, things like that, obviously being sold to rural America, right? And we got to remember, this time he's in Cincinnati, Ohio. Yes, Cincinnati is one of the major American cities at this time, but just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio is some of the richest farm country in America at the time, right? So, and he was producing up in Marion, Indiana as well. How many people have been through Indiana? That is farm country. So there was a demand for these, and there was an interest in them. But as I got to thinking about it, this all sounded very familiar to me. And I think it probably might sound familiar to some of you as well. A multi-use, affordable vehicle for the masses. Why does that sound so familiar? Oh, the Ford Model T. Exactly. This is what Henry Ford was attempting to do in the early 1900s as well. Late 1908, he introduces the 1909 Ford Model T. And although Ford himself does not introduce accessories that you could have with the car like Crosley did, a whole bunch of industries spring up around the Model T to offer all kinds of rural America attachments for the vehicle, whether that be tractor conversions, so you could make your car into a tractor during the day and then take it back to the barn, pull that rear end out, put the different rear end back in, and have your touring car for the weekend or whatever you needed to do. Or even have what they call the work-afford, which was an attachment that would actually go into the crank hole of the engine and be able to power a drum to drive belts, to drive other equipment, right? You could drive your washing machine, you could drive the corn sheller, you could drive all these different things off your Model T. And there was also companies offering front skis and snowmobile kits for the Model T, okay? So, although there's probably no evidence of it that I've been able to find anywhere, we have to remember that Powell Crosley was deeply interested in the automobile from his earliest days and would have known the Model T very well, okay? So it is very likely that part of his idea of the Crosley Farmer Road was influenced by everything that went on around the Ford Model T and being able to make that into a car for the masses, but also one that was a car for the American farmer, okay? And being able to use it on the farm and still have a car for your family. That's really what it comes down to. The Model T was a car for the farm and the family, and the Crosley Farm Road was exactly that, a car for the farm and a car for the road. That's where the name came from, okay? So, the takeaway from all of this. Since the earliest days of the automobile, many people in the industry have understood the need for an affordable car for the masses. This has given rise to an incredible history of the automobile, especially here in the U.S., with somewhere around 3,000 automobile manufacturers having existed since the late 1800s in the U.S. alone. That's not around the world, that's the U.S. alone. Within the vehicles that have been produced by those companies, we see an incredible diversity of vehicles, from the most expensive coach-built cars that only the wealthiest could afford, some of those being ones that were designed and styled by the Count that we talked about, all the way down to the most affordable utilitarian vehicles that could be produced, the Model T, the Crosley Farmer Road, the American Austin, the American Bantam, all of those cars. And in my opinion, these affordable cars, they may not have been met with grand acceptance by Americans and the U.S. culture, but they often filled the need for those who needed a car the most, okay? The average American at this time was the person who needed a car the most, and it was the companies that focused on building an affordable car for the masses that were able to give those people what they needed in our country. Okay? And honestly, it's often these affordable vehicles for the masses that have the most interesting stories behind them, because they're the ones that were actually used as a day-to-day machine and built stories within families and within our culture, more so than, say, a Vanderbilt Rolls-Royce or Duesenberg that was owned by name the actor or actress, right? That's the story they have. Oh, this was owned by, trying to think of a name, and I'm blanking on celebrity names from the 1920s. That's terrible. But Cary Grant. Okay, there we go. I got one. This was owned by Cary Grant, or Gary Cooper actually famously owned one. And then this is a coach-built car that was owned by the Vanderbilt family. Well, that's great. It's nice to see. They're great cars. But if you want to get a really rich, great story about a family or someone that was doing something rugged and raw in America, it's very often these little cars that are often forgot about because they were for the masses and they got thrown away. Okay? So, all of that being said, I'll thank you guys for joining us today here at the Savoy to listen to me talk about small cars in America. And I believe we have time for a Q&A.
We do. So if you would, please, we have microphones. If you would wait for me to get the microphone to you, because we are recording this, and we won't be able to hear the question if you don't wait for the microphone. So if you'll just raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone around. Okay.
Got one down there, one over here.
Would you speculate on if the Farmer Road had been four-wheel drive with front drive capability, if that would have been maybe a bigger game winner?
So that's interesting. I actually forgot to mention that. The Farmer Road is technically four-wheel drive, as advertised by the Crosley Car Company, okay? But you guys know how they did that? It was a little trick on the Crosley advertising part. If you'll notice, there's dual rear wheels on the rear axle. All four of those wheels are powered. So it's four-wheel drive. I didn't come up with it. Crosley came up with it. To say that, if it was a true four-wheel drive where you could engage the front wheels, the front axle as a power axle, a driven axle, and have it, it may have done better, but it's hard to say. I mean, there's not a lot of accounts that I ever came across that people were like, I got the Farmer Road stuck in the mud. If only that front axle would have, it's hard to say. I mean, if we could go back and do oral histories with people that owned them, we might find that. But, I probably I grew up on a big farm in Michigan, and in the spring, you would engage the four-wheel drive a lot more often than have it in two-wheel drive. So I imagine there were probably times that it could have used it, but it's also a really lightweight car. So, how much it would really sink in, hard to say.
Okay, over here.
I was wondering, given you were speaking about the Jeep design, I was wondering why the Jeep design and the contract with the military wouldn't have saved the company before it went under.
Bantam? That is a really good question. I think with the situation, at least from what I've been able to read on it, the situation that American Bantam was in, even a government contract, they just weren't going to be able to pull off, producing the Jeep and all of that. They just were not in a situation where that was capable for them. Marietta, did you find anything more about that part?
That was really the volume. They could not produce the volume that was
Yeah, the volume. Yep.
So that's why they went to the larger manufacturer.
Yep. So it really came down to them not being able to produce the volume. Yeah. Bantam 6,000. Yeah. A lot. Yeah. 2,200 Bantam Jeeps. Yeah. They did turn out a few Jeeps. Yeah, they turned out about 2,000, 2,200 Bantam Jeeps before closing the doors. Yeah.
I was wondering if any of Crosley's earliest attempts are still out there as examples of that early time before he succeeded in the higher production volumes.
The crab that I talked about?
Cars or things of this nature.
So as far as we know, the Marathon 6 prototype was probably scrapped out. I cannot find any DeCross cycle cars that still exist. Doesn't mean one's not hanging in a barn somewhere. And the CRAD, the Crosley Radio Auto Division prototype, still exists. That picture was actually taken from a Crosley gathering just a few years ago that I found online, actually, that the CRAD is still out there.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yep.
In the old days, you could open a Popular Mechanics magazine and you could find kit cars in there that you could order and build. Now, I was trying to remember the names of some of those, but they don't really, are they too small to be considered in the same category of car that we're talking about here? Well, I'm not sure that they were street legal, but I just don't know.
The kit cars you could get?
Yes.
It depends on which ones you're talking about, because there've been a number of those, kit cars, as you say, over time. Some of them more popular than others. Especially when you get into the post-war era, you get a lot of the fiberglass companies, basically kit car companies using fiberglass because it becomes so easy to produce kit cars. Those are often much larger vehicles than these. The kit cars of that style, the sports cars and things like the Woodall Wildfire and some of those cars. Glass Bar did one. There were a number out there. But there were other kits. There were actually plans in Popular Mechanics where you wouldn't even have to buy anything from Popular Mechanics or the company that was advertising. Sometimes people just published plans to build a car. And a lot of people did that. We're actually crazy enough at Lane Motor Museum to we actually build some of those. We go back and get the plans out of the old Popular Mechanics books. We're actually currently building what was known as the Fold-A-Car that was found in one of the French, I think it was, versions of Popular Mechanics. And it's a wooden car that has hinges all over it. And you basically, put it in your garage, all folded up, and when you need to go somewhere, you pull it out and you unlock a bunch of latches and you fold it all out and get it all locked together, and you're supposed to be able to drive it. Needless to say, we've had to re-engineer a few things along the way because you do it the way the plan was, and you tried to fold something and it didn't fold. So, there were those cars around. They definitely didn't fit, let's say, the small car production world. They were more just people trying to find ways to build a car, as cheaply as possible. Did that answer the question? Okay.
Okay, we got one from a young gentleman right up here.
He sees that you have four wheels, and then he sees the fifth wheel, and he's wondering about that wheel that's not touching the ground.
Ah, great question from that young man. That happens to be my son. So this is what is known as a spare tire. Okay? So obviously for the front, not for the rear. But yeah, occasionally you get a flat tire. You have to have a spare, so there's your spare tire. Good answer, bud? All right.
I was going to say it's interesting that Europeans who were kids during World War II and grew up, they had cars like this. And as Nicola Bulgari said, those with money eventually really lusted after the big American cars they dreamed about back then after World War II. Nice thing about his collection is that he also collects lower cost cars for the masses.
Oh, yes.
Which he appreciates for their style and not just the high dollar collector items.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. That is the interesting thing. And one of the things we try to show at Lane Motor Museum, we're one of the largest European car collections in the United States that's on exhibit for the general public to see. And we focus on a lot of those small European and really, let's just call it, foreign-made cars, because we have cars from all over. Name a country, I can probably say we have a car from it. Kazakhstan, probably not. But, it goes back again just to that mentality of how old those countries are in their development of roadways and villages and cities, and everything is just tighter there because you only had to get a horse and a cart through. So you kind of had to build the cars small enough to be able to get around in those cities. And the only place you really saw the high-end European cars was out in the countryside, right? The wealthiest of the wealthy that had country estates would own your Rolls Royces or your Delahaye's out of France, that are these big, beautiful, gorgeous cars. Well, those were the countryside cars. Those were out at the estate. And then in the city, we had much smaller cars, often chauffeur driven, obviously, if you're that wealthy. But yeah, it's also interesting. And again, I say it's one of the things we talk about at Lane Motor Museum is how kind of history and culture and society have shaped automobiles. Because even when you go to other countries, Japan, China, you look at the type of vehicles that are there, the way they're designed and engineered and built, the culture plays into that, right? The society, the culture, and just the general development of that part of the world plays into how an automobile is developed. Here in the U.S., wide open spaces. So we're going to build big, beautiful cars that are going to be able to go across the country. And, it's going to be all about road trips and going out and seeing America, right? See the USA in your Chevrolet, right? And everywhere else, well, I got to get into the city center. I got to be able to get a car through this big of a street. You're not going to take a 1500 Silverado through there. So it is interesting that it's, and it goes back to, again, why cars like this really just didn't catch on in the U.S. We didn't need a small car. There were people that needed an affordable car, but it didn't need to be tiny. It just needed to be affordable. Yeah.
Okay, question here.
Actually, I was thinking that given this whole discussion and presentation, it seems like the American car market kind of geared itself around cars that everybody could afford. So I was just wondering, given like Nissan's current situation and coming in from kit car, how did they get so far away from what the foundation was to begin with? Now that things are so unaffordable, and now they're basically going belly up because they can't sell anything.
Yeah, that's a good question that I think only history will be able to answer. I don't know that we have an answer to that right now, right? I mean, the only thing what I normally talk about when we start discussing, let's say, modern automotive history and some of those questions, the one time period I think we can look back to the best is the 1970s and 1980s in America. Because, what was that? Ugly cars. They were kind of ugly, but there seems to be within the American auto industry a disconnect sometimes with what is happening in America and the global market. And in the 1970s, of course, we saw the OPEC oil crisis, right? We saw the gas crunch. And America had to figure out how to build smaller, more efficient cars, right? And get that sorted out, because that's really when the imports started to take over in the U.S., because they got better gas mileage. They just, everything was just seemed better with an import car compared to what America was building. We were coming out of the muscle car craze where, we had 396 cubic inch engines that would get 7 miles to the gallon. And now all of a sudden gas is ridiculously priced. And the American auto industry figured out how to make smaller, more efficient cars pretty quickly, right? We had things come out like the Gremlin and, all the little cars that were brought out. The Chevette was brought out late 70s. What was that? 79 was the first year of production? 76, somewhere in there, yeah. So we figured it out, right? And we had more efficient cars. And then oil didn't become such a crisis. We figured things out, and the prices of gas came down a little, and things normalized. And then all of a sudden in the mid-1980s, we got into what we call the Malaise land yacht era. And we had things like Delta 88s running around, which were 30 feet long and 10 feet wide. That's an exaggeration. But all of a sudden, it's like the American auto manufacturers kind of forgot that we had just gone through this situation and figured out that most Americans wanted something more efficient. And that would, save their pocketbooks from having to spend too much on gas in their cars. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, we were like, oh, yeah, well, that's over. Let's build giant cars that don't get as much gas mileage anymore. So I think we have to look back at that and say, sometimes there's a disconnect, and how we fix that, I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think that's it on the
All right.
question. So
Any other question?
Thank you very much, Derek.
All right.
Appreciate it. So
Thank you. Thank you for all coming out.
yeah. And thank you, everybody, for coming out here on a Saturday afternoon and joining us here in the theater. Hope to see you back here for the next program and or the next movie we have coming up. So thanks again.